I'm Caroline O'Donnell. I'm the chair of the architecture department. And as Sam said, the words that come before all else, they're an ancient supplication of the indigenous Six Nations people, an address, not a prayer, an expression of gratitude and empathetic connection to all of creation. Before we begin, Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Goyakono, the Cayuga Nation. The Goyakono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. And we acknowledge the painful history of the Goyakono dispossession and honor the ongoing connections of Goyakono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. In 1871, the Department of Architecture was among the first departments founded at Cornell University, where, according to one of the founders, any person could find instruction in any study. 150 years later, we're celebrating the department's sesquicentennial via many events, but this one is the Symposium Breaking Grounds, and it's structured as a 3-part symposium plus a keynote, which we had on Tuesday evening, a wonderfully inspiring lecture by Tim Ingold on matters of ground and generation. The entire symposium hopes to examine the fundamental interconnectedness of our discipline with global ecologies and cultures, alongside the consideration of future trajectories of practice and pedagogy in architecture. The Preston H. Thomas Symposium is funded through a gift to Cornell's College of Architecture, Art and Planning from Ruth and Leonard B. Thomas of Auburn, New York, in memory of their son, Preston. So, an anniversary calls for celebration, as my daughter would remind me very frequently, but we're also provided here an opportunity to zoom out, really far out, and to reflect and ask and probe the answers to important questions. The discipline of architecture is at a pivotal moment with regard to our critical engagement with our histories and our foundations, the evolution of design practice and its concerns, and approaches to pedagogy that guide emerging generations of architects. Our community is ready to disrupt our thinking about possible worlds that are more sustainable, equitable, smart, meaningful in the future. So the notion of ground is fundamental to this symposium because we're talking about the ground upon which our intellectual practices are constructed, the Cornell education, and especially the Cornell architecture education that's been built up over all of these years. But when we think about the establishment of our department and our institution, we must think of the very literal ground that was dispossessed from the people native to this area in order for the institution to exist. But beyond, when we think about questions of ground and land and earth in relation to those native to this area, we open up a whole world of theory and folklore on what the ground, the earth, actually means that happen to be very relevant to the theories and practices that are resurfacing in our discipline today. So the term breaking grounds, of course, refers to the beginning of an architectural or construction project. We're looking back to the breaking ground, the first constructions of Cornell architecture. But we're also taking this as an opportunity to break with those traditions and looking at how practitioners and teachers are beginning to transform the discipline through alternative forms of practice and pedagogy today. Our discipline is rapidly changing. The former model of the powerful client without a building without consequences is being replaced with models in which architects are activists, changing policies, engaging with communities, and designing for difference, in which architects are rethinking material practices, energy practices, and really upending the entire construction industry to think about questions of waste, sustainability, and health. In which architects are collaborating with engineers, computer scientists, designers to envision future technological worlds. And these 3 strands, justice, ecology, and technology, are no longer considered separate as we begin to hear terms like climate justice and, for example, understand the relationship between big data and urban demographics and how designers understanding urban patterns can also begin to intervene and propose change. In the 20th century, much of architecture was concerned with aesthetics and form still matter. In fact, they might matter more now because architecture is not just a functional discipline, it's an art in which ideas are communicated. So when we make a building, that building says something to all who pass by. This is a very powerful tool that we have as architects. How can we not only do things that are environmentally and socially and politically and technologically transformative, but how can we say that we are doing those things through the act of architecture? So on Tuesday, we heard the keynote from Tim Ingold, who unpacked the etymology of many words that I really enjoyed, but I don't think he unpacked the word generation, which was one of the words in his subtitle, Rethinking Ground, Generation and Education. Generation, to take a leaf from his book, of course, comes from generare in Latin, meaning to bring forth, to give birth, to produce. And we use the word generation quite a lot, I would say, in architecture, especially computationally today. But on Tuesday, Ingold talked about perhaps how we might be reminded that generation also points to kinship, love, continuity, family, and the idea that what we do in relation to our environment might also be more generational or responsible. How might we think about the world that we're in as our kin? And so the session tonight really takes on the question of ground, earth, landscape, and land, but also in relation to that notion of kinship. Groundwork, beginning with the grounds on which our institution was built, establishes a foundation upon which architecture's interconnectedness with land, water, and air are built. So before I zoom in to this evening, I will remind you that next Tuesday, March 17th, a very important day to people from my culture, also at 5:15 in this space, also followed by a reception in the Dome. This session, Formwork, examines forms of practice that have emerged from Cornell's pedagogy and asks, how will our discipline transform and what can architects build in the future? That will be a dialogue with Nina Cook-John, Arthur Huang, Laurie Brown, and with moderators Marta Wisniewska and Lily Chi. And the third session, Tuesday 22nd, same time, same place, same celebration afterwards. The session Schoolwork looks at the education of the architect and asks how we might reimagine architectural pedagogy for an evolving world. And that will be presentations and discussions with Dean Milton Curry, Dean Sarah Whiting, and our own Dean Yoon. And that will be moderated by Jenny Sabin and Maria Gonzalez-Pendas. The reception tonight and all of the receptions are inspired by old university banquets. Tonight's banquet is based on the sophomore banquet given at Cornell University on the 10th of May, 1901, to the wearers of the sea. I'm not sure what that means. However, we've taken the menu and you'll see some strange but delicious treats, olive salted peanuts and crackers, crab salad en mayonnaise, prime roast beef, Apollinaris water, which is top of the list on the original menu for some reason, and a red wine sorbet, which is a translation of a claret sherbet. So we can look forward to feeling what it was like in 1901 later this evening. I'll also note that there's an exhibition in the Sibley hallway that is timed to coincide with the beginning of the symposium. It's an exhibition curated by Anna Deitch called Forest City, Designing a City Where Human Action and Natural Cycles Can Coexist. And Anna's work looks at indigenous communities who live with nature both in the Amazon and locally. So before introductions for tonight, I'd like to take 2 more minutes to say thank you to all who helped make this event possible. First of all, teaching associate Wendy Gonzalez, Wendelin Gonzalez, can you please stand up? Thank you, Wendy. So Wendy deserves massive credit for putting this such a thoughtful and synergistic lineup together. She's done really an incredible job. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank our speakers who have not only worked on their own original presentations for this symposium, but who have talked and worked collaboratively on answering prompts from the next group that I'll thank, M. Constantine, for their incredibly insightful and thoughtful questions that created an amazing interview that we hope to publish at some point and maybe being pinned up in the Dome as we speak, so visible during the reception. all pulled together in articles by AAP's content strategist, Edith Fikes, overseen by Director of Communications, Alix de Turquoise. Thanks to Lily Chi, Sean Anderson, and John Zisevich for their insights in the early days in the development of the symposium, and really special thanks to Jolene Rickard, who was instrumental in forming the event and the speakers this evening. Thank you to Joy Davis, Qingyao Wang, Jonathan Plass, and Jack Lynch, who are students who have been assisting with all of the production, and especially the delivery of the chocolates to all of the students' desks as a reminder about tonight. I think, yes, so I will do some really quick introductions because I know we want to get to the main event. We already heard from Sachem Sam George. He's one of 10 sachems, that is chiefs of the Cayuga Nation, representing the Bear Clan. He was condoled in April 2005. Having grown up on Seneca Nation territory and having learned Seneca language and customs, Sachem George sought out to learn his Cayuga heritage. The Haudenosaunee people are a matriarchal society. His mother, Cayuga, knew it was important to learn what it meant to be Cayuga. So when he moved back to his homeland in 2014, as one of the first important tasks, he oversaw the building of the Cayuga schoolhouse, modeled after a contemporary longhouse. He sits on the Haudenosaunee Environmental Task Force. He's a member of the Haudenosaunee External Relations Committee, and is on the Elders Council for Native Community Services for Buffalo and Niagara Falls. He has 2 sons, a daughter, and 3 grandchildren that live in the greater Buffalo area. Amber Meadow Adams is Lower Mohawk of the Six Nations at Grand River. She holds a PhD in Indigenous Studies from the University at Buffalo and a BA in Literature and Writing from Columbia University. Her short fiction and scholarship have been published in the UK, US, and Canada. She's currently reworking her doctoral research on the Haudenosaunee story of the creation into a novel. We look forward to reading that. Meredith Alberta Palmer Tuscarora is a presidential postdoc at Cornell University in the Department of Science and Technology Studies and the American Indian and Indigenous Studies program. Her current book project, Imperial Evidence, shows how indigeneity disrupts core notions of reason, order, and humanism, which articulate science, technology, and the US colonial state. As a geographer focusing on technologies of occupation, she works to amplify and build ways in which these structures of dominance are refused in lands currently territorialized as North America. And finally, as a teacher and historian specializing in architecture theory, Sébastien Marot is one of the leading voices in the conceptualization of landscaping and the design of rural environments. Educated in philosophy, he holds a PhD in history from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. He's currently a professor at the École d'Architecture in Paris-Est and teaches classes as a visiting professor at the École Polytechnique Fédérale in Lausanne, as well as at the GSD, which is a lot easier to say, where he participates in a program on the conceptualization and design of rural spaces. He's very well known to us here because he's the author of a large number of publications dedicated to critical thinking on urbanism and cities. But one of his books includes the reissue of the famous manifesto by O.M. Ungers and Rem Koolhaas, The City in the City, Berlin, a Green Archipelago. So we will begin with Amber Adams, but thank you to all of you for coming, and thank you to our speakers tonight.
Okay, Scano. Thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you all for being here. I'm delighted to see everyone here. So, when we talk about ground, when we talk about groundwork, we invoke something that in English is very solid, very firm, very stable, static. What I'd like to talk with you about tonight is a completely different way to understand Yatini Staha Johunjage. In Haudenosaunee languages, our mother that is the earth, and in English is ground. If this is truly a pivotal moment for the discipline of architecture, then I invite everyone here to pivot toward what the original architects of this place thought when they were shaping and building relationships with it. And yes, that's certainly the Gayogohono, the Cayuga Nation, the Haudenosaunee. But beyond that, truly the architects of this place that we are all in and we all share together are other than human. And that's most of what the Haudenosaunee of Earth's creation discusses and talks about. There we go. So the first thing we have to ask is, well, what kind of place is this? Gayogohono, the name of the nation, as Soyoi Sechem George pointed out, means place by the water, place by the lake, swampland, wetland. It's a very precious, fragile kind of biome that it's hard for us in the 21st century to really and truly see. So much of it has been developed, drained, altered, changed, poisoned with heavy industry and overdevelopment. But really, truly, all of the Haudenosaunee homeland is very well watered. This is the St. Lawrence River system. This is the Great Lakes drainage basin. But this is really, truly, particularly visible here in this place where earth and water overlap, meet, join, reconfigure in an almost infinite number of ways. When we talk about, in Haudenosaunee languages, what nations we are from, we identify them by topography, geographical features, what's in the earth. Ganyak Gehaga, Niwago Mwanjoda, place of the flint or chert is the kind of earth I am set down on. Onondaga, place of the hills is where I'm set down on. Unodowaga, Seneca, place of the mountains. Unuyataaga, place of the standing stone, is the kind of earth I'm set down on. So immediately when we talk about nation, when we talk about identity, whether it be political, ecological, social, cultural, legal, where we start is what kind of earth. Not what earth, what kind of earth. And the way we define kind is something that is explored in many different dimensions in the Haudenosaunee story of creation and Haudenosaunee narrative as a whole. The constant really throughout this story is change. Le plus ça change, it seems to be almost a bit reductive, but in this story, the ground that we're standing on is not ground at all, it's flesh. When we talk about Yatini Staha, our mother, Johunjage, the earth, we are talking about a woman who comes here, and here isn't really a place at all in the beginning. There is no ground to stand on at first. But a woman who comes from a place above to avoid darkness and water. She falls from this place of security and staticity and solidity, a place where there's no day, no night, no winter, no summer, no death, no change, no temporality. And in building earth, we make compromises between those states. We resolve these tensions by creating time. As soon as we create time, we create change. As soon as we create change, we create a set of constantly altering states. And the way that this story outlines, discusses, uses, works with this idea of constant change is to describe our Mother, the Earth, as a literal physical body. This body moves. One of the most important realizations I think I had about this woman who falls from the sky, this place above, that eventually builds and becomes Earth. Her name is Yoji Jisung. One of the most important realizations I had about her was that she's a refugee. First and foremost, and before anything else, she has lost her home. She's a climate refugee. She's not necessarily a refugee from violence, as is this young mother in this photograph, but she is a refugee from a conflict that is between life and death in the most literal sense. She's a stranger. She has no place to land. She has nothing with her except the child that she carries. She is a seed dropped from a place above. She carries seeds from this place above. Inside her, she grows a seed from this place above, but there's nowhere for it to germinate. There's nothing for it to grow into anything else here. Another important thing to realize about Yoji Jisung, this woman who makes and becomes Earth, is that she transforms. In many Haudenosaunee stories, in fact, if you look at some of the world's narratives, everything from the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, the Lays of Marie de France, stories throughout kind of the ancient world, the medieval world, even into the early modern world, are about protagonists who don't change. Mikhail Bakhtin calls this adventure time in some of his work. In this particular instance, this woman, Yoji Jisung, is a fully realized three-dimensional character. She's the only being we see within this narrative world from conception until the end of her life. And throughout it, we see how exactly her consciousness changes, her physicality changes, her will, her intention, what in Haudenosaunee languages we call gatnigonla, alter, evolve, transform as she moves through this story. We understand in every phase of her development that this is a being that's meant to change. And if this being is meant to change, as she seeds the earth, so is Earth meant to change. Now, when this woman, Yoji Jisung, falls from this place above where there's no change, into a void, into darkness, into a seemingly bottomless void, she's helped. And the first beings that help her are water birds that are already in this place below. And as she falls, they rise up and they catch her and they ease her down toward the water. These are shorebirds, herons, geese, ducks. And they get Ranyadankoa, the great snapping turtle, to agree to support her. Also, an amphibian, a liminal being, a creature who lives both on land and in water and moves back and forth. And this is what supports this woman, and this is what supports her as she grows Earth. But first, she needs some material. She has on her only her clothing, only her skin, the dirt and the seeds under her fingernails and between her fingers as she tried to break her fall. And a series of creatures offer to dive down to the bottom of the water to retrieve a little bit, some mud, some slime, some growing medium. First to do so is beaver. He floats to the surface dead. Second to do so is otter. An otter floats to the surface dead. Third to do so is the smallest and least strong of all the divers, and that's muskrat. Muskrat floats to the surface dead too, but he succeeded in getting just a little bit of mud between his tiny paws and his tiny teeth. And this Yojijiso carefully scrapes, puts on Turtle's back, and begins to grow. In many versions of the story, she dances, she spreads with her hands, she works with this substance until it is big enough to support her and her child, at least to the point of some degree of survival for a while. They don't know how long. The child that she has is a daughter. The daughter becomes pregnant. The daughter dies in childbirth after giving birth to twin boys, Dawiskarlo and Harunhiwago. When she's died, her mother puts her body in the ground, this ground that is now big enough to support her and her daughter and her grandsons and many other things that are growing and expanding and changing in this place. And she says to the boys, leave her for 10 days. At the end of that time, she'll rise up again. Well, this isn't what happens. Dawiskarlo injures her body, makes it so that she can't rise again, but instead, different species of plants grow. And some of these are medicine plants, some of these are food plants, but these are the things that are immediately needed to sustain the lives of the people who remain on Earth. And I found this particularly interesting piece of art, Lingxi Girl, which is actually a growth of mushrooms on this base, and it's a pretty stunning, I think, example of the idea of moving substance, of transforming literally from one's body into the earth and into things that will grow and sustain and feed other bodies. But this idea of sort of recycling is something that's carried even further forward in the story when Yojijiso eventually integrates herself into the body of the earth. In some versions of the story, her head becomes the moon. We call her our grandmother, Yonki Sota Sota Neka Garakwa. And as her sons and grandsons grow up, they too put their own effort, their own substance, their own breath, their own life into all of the different creatures that emerge as the story goes forward. And their emergence follows a pattern of ecological recovery after disaster. We have a bare, wet turtle shell as sort of ground zero, and slowly the species of different kinds of cereal succession. First, hundesa, the strawberry plants, very low-growing plants that spread by suckers that don't require very deep or very rich soil, and then sunflowers, and then bushes, and then trees. And eventually we get almost to the point of being a Carolinian biome that would have been recognizable to our ancestors here hundreds, if not thousands of years ago. One of the things that we see in this story is ganusa. And then this is a beautiful example of a beadwork pattern often seen on Haudenosaunee women's clothing. And if you look at the very bottom, you can see a series of half circles with sort of triad leaf shapes and curves kind of blossoming from the top of them. Ganusa is an interesting word. It's usually translated as house or dwelling. And we can see here, this is a photo of village site recreated at Crawford Lake in Ontario, we can see here why. The roof of these traditional dwellings that our ancestors lived in is domed, partly to deal with heavy snowfalls, partly as something that would insulate these bark walls, traditionally made of elm bark, which weren't very thick, but when it became cold enough for snow to fall, the snowpack itself would insulate the dwelling to a degree. But this verb root nous is also something that's used to express the idea of a dome, the abstracted shape, but also a mound, as I said, a home or a dwelling, also a skull, the dome of the skull. And in fact, the word for brain in at least most of the Ganyat-Geha, the Mohawk dictionaries that I've looked in, is also Ganusa. So when we go back to this symbol, we see all of these different iterations of Ganusa emerge at once. This is the dome of earth on Turtle's Back. This is the house with curls of smoke emerging from the smoke holes. This is the mound of earth that we grow our Gayantosula, maize, beans, squash in, and these are the shoots of the germinating plants. This is the mound where the things that sustain our lives now, the Junhekwa, grew out of Sky Woman's daughter's buried body. But this is also thought. This is also concept. And this can be interpreted as sort of the blooming of thoughts and of communication. So there are these multiple layers and resonances of meaning that are bound up in this beautiful traditional pattern of beadwork. One more way of interpreting this shape, this ganusa, this dome, is as part of a sinusoidal waveform. If we see the pattern repeated, one after the other, we don't quite see articulated the troughs. What we see are the peaks. But if we imagine this design at the edge of the skirt as being reflected, then the troughs that aren't present, that aren't visible, that aren't represented, are implied. Wrong way, sorry. Here we are. So if we think about a smooth, even, curvilinear sinusoidal waveform, we think about a word that I said at the beginning of this presentation, and that Soyowi Sachem George said too, which is skana. Skana is usually translated as peace, but like many Haudenosaunee verb roots, it has multiple meanings encoded in it at once. How many people have heard the word orenda in here? A few of you, okay. It's an interesting misrepresentation of the word orlana. Orlana, usually translated as word, speech act, talk, discussion. Orlana is the act of communication, usually one human being to another. Garlana is even more characteristically human. It's song. Song, chant, poem. Gasana is name, but in the metaphorical sense, your reputation, what name you have created for yourself, what people think of you. It's a very socially constructed version of this verb root. Aana, if anyone's ever drawn a bow in here, aana is the sound that's made when the string is released and the arrow is moving. It's a vibration it's a hum, it's very distinct. All of these are variations of a single verb root that signifies frequency. It's the amplitude and the closeness or farness apart of the peaks and troughs. It's the quality of sound, the volume, the pitch, the timbre. But it's not just sound waves, of course. It's light waves that enable us to interpret the world around us visually. It's infrasonic waves, the different ways that many kinds of species in this biome communicate with each other. It's something that you are capable of feeling, hearing, seeing. And all of these come together in this word, skano. Skano is nothing less than the total harmony of all parts of creation together. So when we talk about peace, in Haudenosaunee languages, we're not talking about the absence of conflict or violence. What we're talking about is not a negative. It's not the absence of anything. It's this positive, moment-by-moment choice that all of us engage in, not just all human beings, but all parts of creation together. Now, we assume within this Haudenosaunee narrative of Earth's creation that all the different beings that do accept responsibility for humanity, who come last, who come weakest, who come most dependent, are going to continue to fulfill those responsibilities. And we have commitments from different animal species, and we have different commitments from plant species. We have different commitments from other kinds of beings who agree to take certain actions over and over and over again, not only to protect human beings, but to protect the totality of creation on which human beings depend. Now, I don't want to give you the impression that this story is human-centric, but it is a narrative that humans are telling other humans in order to reproduce, inculcate, normalize a way of relating to this biome that will allow it to sustain us. But here's the thing about waves. They don't hold still. Definitionally, there are peaks, there are troughs, there are shifts, there are wobbles. The ground that we stand on is not a solid place. It can't possibly be. If it were, we would lose. We would be unable to sustain the harmony that's necessary for us to continue to live here. So if we really think about the idea of skano as kind of a seed principle that guides everything else, if we, or I should say you, because the people here are those who are going to be planning and designing and executing, they're going to be the ones who are actually breaking ground in the years and the decades to come. What becomes possible if you really truly engage with and embrace the idea of skano, of a universe, of an earth, of a ground that continually and perpetually shifts? Another part of the creation story that I realized, I think, late, is that every single being in it has gasastansala, creative agency, the capacity to alter any other part of creation at any time. And in fact, an important element of skano is the idea that the initial force that's maintaining this motion, this wave, this harmony, is the actions of all of the beings in this place together collectively. If we really and truly embrace that idea, that we are surrounded by creators, that no sooner is this place made than it is made again and again and again, in an infinite set of branchings outward, what does that enable us to do when we talk about a pivot? What does that enable us to think about? What does that enable us to do differently when we approach a building, a campus, a park, or any of the ways in which 21st century North America interprets the idea of ganusa, a dwelling not only of the body but of the mind? What becomes possible if we truly begin with skana, and what becomes no longer possible? What can we no longer entertain the idea of? Do we have to break ground in order to interact with Yatini Stahan Johunjage? And if we really aren't permitted by this idea that the Haudenosaunee have been living with and carrying forward for thousands of years in this place, then what's the alternative? What do we begin to do, and how do we begin to do it? And what language do we use to speak about when we plan and think and imagine and all of those things that come out of the ganusa that is here rather than here? And I think I'll leave you with this incredible image the night before Sky Woman arrived, And this, to me, represents the antithesis of skana, this paced, harmonic, smooth sine wave. This is a bit more what a noisy waveform looks like. It's jagged, it's irregular, it's a bit asymmetrical. This is what's here before anything is here. This is the water. This is the void. This is the emptiness that is before turtle and muskrat and heron and yojijiso, the woman from the place above, comes. This is what is before the seed germinates and bursts its shell. And this is the contrast, in my mind, between what becomes possible when we embrace the sine wave of skana versus what's left if we do not. And I think I'll leave it there. Nyaokoa, taneto.
I'm going to put this on because I find it hard to talk and breathe at the same time in masks. Twantskanaha, everyone. Again, I'm Meredith Alberta Palmer. Thank you, Sachem Sam George, for putting through the words before all else for us. And thank you to the organizers and to Jolene Rickard for the generous invitation, and to my fellow speakers for the conversation we're going to have here today. Today I'll be talking a bit about the theme of interconnectedness, which was suggested for this symposium. And I want to start with a reminder that interconnectedness does not imply harmony. It doesn't imply equity between those entities, peoples, or beings who are interconnected. Relations structured by dominance are relations nonetheless. And one enduring and clear relation of domination is that between U.S. federal and state governments and institutions and indigenous or tribal nations and their territories. So the impetus for my talk today is how to move forward towards good relations. Recently, I was listening to a talk given by Cree scholar Willie Ermine. He talked about how he envisioned the university, the academy, as a being with an insatiable appetite that needed to eat for it to grow. And part of the food that it ate, he said, was indigenous knowledge, and it would grow bigger. And the university would recruit people like him, indigenous scholars, to feed it. And a key concern that I've heard from many indigenous intellectuals inside and outside of the academy is, how do we feed then our own knowledge systems? How do we make sure that our students, that communities lend to the university, are not captured there, and that they can go back and feed their people's knowledge systems? How can we make sure that indigenous knowledge systems are also being fed? And I found this a very compelling analogy presented by Dr. Ermine. How do we direct our work not to feed the university, but to feed indigenous knowledge systems? And I think Dr. Amber Adams' work comes far closer to this than mine does at the moment. Nonetheless, I want to suggest that another way of understanding the historic groundwork of Cornell, how Cornell came physically to be in this space, and what doctrines and beliefs made Cornell possible, I want to talk about how they relate to the material dispossession of Haudenosaunee and other indigenous peoples. So first in this talk, I'm going to discuss my work on the development of the land survey system in the United States. And then I do this to ground the ways in which the Anglo-Saxon agrarian dream, which is so often discussed here at Cornell, was rooted in anti-indigenous practices of dispossession that work to transform indigenous homelands and territories into property of the U.S. nation state. Second, I'm going to connect these rationales and colonial logics to the land grant or land grab university report and Cornell's place in it. My hope is that this groundwork for understanding Cornell's relation to indigenous dispossession, materially as well as through its founding principles, can start to shed light on how to reconfigure those relations of domination. So part one of my talk is, I might title it, What's an Acre Got to Do with Racism? The land survey techniques had been taken up with new earnestness in Europe in the 1600s, as the growing gentry of England required the measure of their landed property. In settler colonial contexts, however, these practices and tools of land survey were co-constituted with racial hierarchies. And it was in the context of survey and mapping land in colonial U.S. America that the idea of improving land became a metonym for a racial project carried out by a population of improved people. The content of this claim to territory and good governance and democracy merged a white laboring body with a particular kind of landscape. And this dynamic became manifest beginning in the mid-1780s, when Thomas Jefferson, then governor and son of a wealthy Virginia land surveyor, was tasked with developing the National Land Survey Method, which today you might see as PLSS, or the Public Land Survey System. When Jefferson formulated his scientific spatial division of land based on so-called natural law, he did so through racial agrarian imaginaries that were linked to systems of governance. Writing to an English political reformer in 1824, Jefferson explicitly laid out the Anglo-Saxon racial counter-narrative that animated his plans for Virginia, where he had been governor, and his plans for the survey of the western states, or what would come to be the western states. The division of land into counties that measured 6 square miles, aligning with what he called the hundreds of your Saxon Alfred, being King Alfred, was the basis of measurement from which local agrarian life and representative government would be organized. Each township, he imagined, would be, quote, a small republic within itself, containing a school, a militia, a police, infrastructure, and location for local elections. And he called this township, quote, the most admirable of human contrivances in government. Dividing the country's land by a multiple of what he called the Anglo-Saxon acre was not only reasoned in relation to numerical neatness based in divisions by 4, but also as a political choice sparked by a Euro-American settler imaginary of racial superiority, which was rooted in natural law. Jefferson, the son of this wealthy Virginia surveyor, Peter Jefferson, spent years researching and devising this national survey system, hoping that, quote, the globe of the earth itself would furnish an invariable measure. He sought to standardize the measure of an acre that emerged from ancient farming practices of Anglo-Saxons. He would eventually choose a tool called the Gunter's chain, which was an English tool for measurement that United States surveyors following Jefferson's directives would adopt in their efforts to standardize land measurement, to turn it into heritable property. The Gunter's chain, flexible and reliable, was easy to transport long distances over roadless terrain that surveyors needed to travel. The units of the Gunter's chain emerged out of Anglo-Saxon farming customs, measuring 66 feet long, equaling 22 yards or 4 rods. Each chain had 100 links. There are 10 square chains to the acre, 80 chains to the mile, and 640 acres to the square mile. 4 rods was the area regarded as 1 day's worth of agricultural work by Saxon farmers, and 40 days of work was equivalent to 1 acre. Particularly, this was the amount of land that was commonly plowed in 1 day by 2 oxen pulling a wooden plow. European machinery and modes of production then formed the measures by which a plot of land in the newly independent United States would be divided. The figure of the plowman was advanced into the position of property owner once this line was drawn around his territory. So Euro-American models of production for market were brought into being by the figure of a white Euro-American plowman, forming the sublimated or invisibilized elements of commodified property. Jefferson's Anglo-Saxon dream, then, was rooted in racial thinking and the myth of Anglo-Saxonism. Through this myth, New Americans narrated a history for themselves in which democracy and independent agrarian familialism, which they valued so much, was rooted in Saxon practices and explicitly against indigenous lifeways. Foreshadowing what would become to be called manifest destiny later in the 1840s, Jefferson understood U.S. American colonization to be a natural historical trend, continuing the territorial expansion of Anglo-Saxons, a supposedly superior race of people. And he framed his work as a moral imperative, linked to reaching a social utopia as much as a historical destiny, a narrative that is still widely taught in the U.S. schooling system today. So, holding particular British agricultural and governmental practices that he identified to be Anglo-Saxon as a civilizational apex, Jefferson and others viewed Anglo-Saxon lifeways as far superior, as advanced compared to that of who they called Indians. Jefferson put various concepts of labor to work, the idea that what you put into the land makes land have value, it improves land. And he put this into a racial framework, making the argument that Indian bodies were incapable of productive labor on the land beyond drudgery or mere survival, as he called it. For example, holding the assumption that European food production was abundant and native food production is scarce, he wrote, quote, "Where food is regularly supplied, a single farm will show more of cattle than a whole country can of buffaloes." Ironically, without the food provided to survey teams by indigenous peoples in Western New York and across the country during the years that the surveyors were taking place, those land surveys never would have been possible. But Jefferson imagined Native people to be people who, quote, lived principally on the spontaneous productions of nature, and those who did not partake in agricultural practices to create tradable stock. Native food provision, including hunting, collecting conferred resources, and growing carefully bred crops in ecologically efficient ways for collective consumption, rather than for market, was unrecognizable to colonists as more than mere survival. Euro-American settlers worked then within a framework in which there was no physical or conceptual space for sovereign indigenous territoriality or governance, and today this governance is still often glossed. So Jefferson's survey system was the system used to make property of indigenous homelands west of the 1763 proclamation line, which ran roughly through this Finger Lakes region. I'm not going to take the time to go into more details about how this survey system was laid on the lands of what is now called Western New York. I also am not going to have the time to discuss how these same racial configurations of indigenous homelands and native land, as disordered, as chaotic, as ungovernable, as an unimproved wilderness, were enacted in the famous 2005 U.S. Supreme Court case, Sherrill versus Oneida Nation of New York, which by both Ginsburg and Scalia alike, which was then later cited in the Second Circuit Court decision of Cayuga Indian Nation of New York versus Pataki, which denied the Gaigahono of New York restitution for over 65,000 acres that was illegally taken by New York State. I've written on this elsewhere. Instead, now I'm going to move to the next part of my talk, which centers Cornell in the new research and restitution projects on land grab universities. Cornell is a place where Indigenous land that it is built on has a different but related history to the Indigenous land that it was built with. So, about land grab universities. In February of 2020, High Country News released an extensive investigative report headed by Tristan Atone and Robert Lee, which mapped out specific connections between the violent dispossession of Indigenous people and the 52 original land-grant universities in the United States founded through the Morrill Act. They named it the Land Grab University Project and launched a website which you can find at landgrabu.org. While this wasn't the first that anyone knew about the devastating effects of the Morrill Act, the in-depth and national scope of the project made it stand out and gain traction. And what was so compelling for people to be able to see and map precisely the tracts of land that land-grant universities profited off of, and to see the value of that land at its original sale and its approximate current valuation. And as I'll discuss later, since this, a wellspring of calls for redress has risen, mostly from within academia, to find out what these universities today owe to Indigenous people. In this report, Cornell University got a front and center focus because it is by a long shot the single largest beneficiary of this land grab of all the 52 universities in this project. It is also the only Ivy League land grant institution. As an Eastern U.S. school, Cornell University received SCRIP for land out west, as New York State has already occupied so much of Haudenosaunee lands. Each piece of land SCRIP allowed the bearer to claim 160 acres of so-called public land anywhere in the United States. Because universities couldn't purchase land in a different state than their own, the idea was that this SCRIP would be sold to individuals, and then these profits would be invested for the endowment of the university. And importantly, these are the foundational funds without which our university would not exist. Part of the reason that Cornell received so much SCRIP was because each university was given 30,000 acres per member of Congress, and at the time New York had a large number of congressional seats. And anyone interested in learning more about this can look at John Parmenter's work, among other faculty work at the Cornell University and Indigenous Dispossession blog. And I should note that a key focus of the Cornell University and Indigenous Disposition Faculty Working Group from the very beginning has been to recognize that while the Morrill Act lands are further west, that the Gaigahono were primarily dispossessed by the state in benefit of Cornell University, and that today the Ithaca campus still occupies their lands. And Cornell also occupies lands of other Haudenosaunee peoples and Indigenous peoples in New York State. Within Tompkins County, Cornell holds 11,000 acres, which is 4% of the county lands, as well as 6,000 acres elsewhere in the state, 2,000 acres elsewhere in the country. And Cornell holds 420,000 acres of mineral rights in central and southwestern states, according to their real estate FAQ website. In historical context, land-grant universities were part of a range of policies in the mid-1800s that were designed to push Indigenous peoples from their territories. For many people, the territories or reservations that we have left are lands that were staunchly defended from these incursions, or lands upon which we've remade our peoplehoods anew after removal. And in the context of the mid-1800s, as I described earlier, the notion of an agrarian democracy was rooted in a narrative about taming a supposed wilderness, which articulated clearly with a political struggle between competing so-called races of people, and a distinct set of policies were the legal outcome of these notions. The Morrill Act was passed in 1862, the same year as the Homestead Act, which deeded over 270 million acres of lands west of the Mississippi, mostly to Euro-American settlers, to encourage Western migration, and the same year as the Pacific Railroad Act, which, among other racist abuses of labor and centralizations of capital, violated the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty with the Lakota. Indigenous homelands were advertised widely at this time as, quote, a garden of the world, open for homestead and preemption. The Morrill Act, which funded the original 52 land-grant universities, including Cornell, was named after U.S. Representative from Vermont, Justin Morrill. It was originally called an act donating public lands to the several states and territories which may provide colleges for the benefit of agriculture and the mechanic arts. Yet lands deemed public in the rubric of U.S. government were already the territories of hundreds of nations of indigenous peoples. In the mid-1800s, the U.S. federal government was cash poor, but very rich in land, given one reason: because of the violent dispossession, displacements, massacres, and outright genocides of indigenous peoples. The Morrill Act took 10.7 million acres, which had been variously and often violently seized or duplicitously obtained under conditions of extreme duress from hundreds upon hundreds of indigenous and tribal nations by the U.S. federal government, and used it to create seed money for a new federal program of higher education and agriculture, which is the university that we're all situated in today. So I do want to say that so far I've been disappointed by the way that Cornell administration has responded to this report, despite the hard work of students and faculty and staff to build a project of redress from within the institution. For example, on the land-grant mission site for Cornell, their statement reads, quote, "We acknowledge that the commendable ideals associated with the Morrill Land-Grant Act of 1862 were accompanied by a painful history of prior dispossession of indigenous nations' lands by the federal government. This historical narrative figures land-grant institutions, which today are still partially funded by the USDA and run as partial public institutions, as somehow wholly separate from the U.S. federal government, untouched by their foundational past, in which indigenous lands expropriated and sold formed the original endowments which made them possible. This framing suggests, and I believe it's incorrect, that land-grant institutions are merely separate benefactors of the federal government's bad actions. The question of morality aside, of being an institution that's profited from the spoils of violence and genocide, these historical ties have been eluded in Cornell's public-facing comments so far. This separation, I think, is institutionally and historically disingenuous. First, the time span between government expropriation and violent dispossession of indigenous lands and when the Morrill Act was first brought to Congress in 1857 was sometimes as little as 5 or 6 years. For example, in 1851, the Dakota Cession enclosed over 825,000 acres from Dakota peoples, and 1 out of 12 of these acres was used to endow 35 different universities. And readers can find many more stories, such as this one, on the website. In other words, the forced removal of indigenous peoples can't in any terms be viewed as a separate era or a distinct or different policy from the kind of westward invasions that were designed within the Morrill Act, Homestead Act, and others. They are of a piece. Second, our university wouldn't exist without this seed money, and moreover, this university has remained linked to state and federal agencies, receiving funding from states and the USDA. Their function as institutions has never been separate from the government. The land grab university question is thus neither one of a solely historical wrong, as the land is still occupied, and the institutions the sale of that land as property benefited are still functioning today, nor can it be viewed as a private error of individuals. This was a systematic project of interlocking genocides and dispossession that rest on a dream of an agrarian democracy, and the land grab university was and is a primary institution of that imperial project of dispossession that is today still pressing into indigenous lands and lives. Land-grant universities then at their founding and today are often thought of as democracy's colleges, and they have to contend then with deep-seated understandings of good intentions or greatest good that play a heavy hand in indigenous erasure. So moving beyond this erasure will mean moving into Indigenous protocols and analytics of land and territory. Lenape scholar Joanne Barker has offered, quote, Indigenous territory as an analytic that provides a way of understanding dispossession as a present-day mode of imperialism, unquote. Or in other words, that this dispossession is formative to the nation state. Mississauga Nishnabeg scholar and author Leanne Simpson has noted how land is the context in which meaning is made of the world, where intergenerational transfer of knowledge and governance occurs, of decision-making and diplomacy. And Amber Adams today has offered us the particularities and emplaced protocols alongside Sachem Sam George for understanding these kinds of relations. Indigenous dispossession, then, is a process, and a violent one and an ongoing one, of transforming and maintaining Indigenous lands as capitalist commodified property. And this is property that may be measured, it may be marked on maps, it can be evaluated on a market and inherited by those individuals who hold a title. And that inheritance is upheld by legal and political systems of enforcement. So Indigenous dispossession, then, is not a one-time event. Stealing or dispossessing land cannot be equated to me, for example, stealing my neighbor's microwave. It's not illegal or legal transfer of existing commodified property. It is and was reformulating, overlaying an entire set of relations among people and between people and other than human beings, and the place and land itself with different governance systems. And this is important to understand for context. The implication is that any payment for land as property or further inclusion into academic institutions is not the end goal for redress or restitution. These may play a part. They could be part of the project, but they're not the end goal. And so in my work on imperial logics underlying the U.S. land survey system that I introduced a bit earlier, and how they were enacted on the land and maintained today through the U.S. Supreme Court, among others, I work to show how U.S. sovereignty over territory presents itself as absolute, singular, and ultimately irreversible. And this becomes common sense thinking. I imagine for many hearing this talk today, it's hard to imagine giving land back to homelands coming under Indigenous governance again. But for many coming from various Indigenous perspectives, the colonial present and its institutions are temporary, a relatively brief presence in a much longer known history. And so I add my voice to a critical body of work that traces how these relations of dominance continue. Notably, there's been no reversal of these kinds of policies I discussed. The Moral Act was never repealed or corrected for in any way. It's still excused, often vaunted. Just as the land itself doesn't disappear as time passes, those relations formed through overlaying property onto Indigenous territories also don't disappear into the past. These relations may be refashioned, they may be rewritten, but they're nonetheless remade each new day. Every day that Indigenous land remains occupied against treaty or through treaties made duplicitously or under duress, that relation of dominance is remade again and again. Haudenosaunee and other Indigenous peoples' knowledge and memories of that land outside of reservation territories doesn't disappear, though. Our memories of and relations to these places are overlaid but not superseded by the impositions of colonial occupation. And so in conclusion, I do want to tread carefully when I discuss these things because I don't want my listeners to close your ears because my words are too harsh. There's value in finding common ground, from learning from each other across difference. And there's such a fine line, I think, between romanticization and co-optation on the one hand, and on learning from each other and building good relations and dialogue on the other. And what does it take to lay the groundwork for that? It's difficult in unequal power dynamics to meet in an ethical space for dialogue. How do we come to a common ground if that ground itself is uneven? To be in dialogue, we can't meet in an ethical space while we carry our doctrines with us unwittingly. So my hope is that this evening I've been able to put a bit of a lens and a light on the colonial doctrines of land and of property that, while historical, have formed lines of tendential force that shape our lives and landscapes today. What relations, what interconnections sustain our lives, sustain our bodies, sustain our careers? Are these the kind of relations that we hope to foster? And if not, what are the methods and practices for building good relations? So I started this talk with a comment about the imperative to feed Indigenous knowledge systems. In part, this means having the space, the land, and the infrastructure in which to flourish and to be, a space from which to dialogue. The way those of us in academic spaces may be able to feed Indigenous knowledge systems is first, of course, to not extract from them ideas that have abstract appeal, and then to bring them into the academy. That will, I predict, always be a failed project. And when we speak of concepts such as those Dr. Amber Adams has spoken of today, these are not abstract ideas. They are rooted in millennia of emplaced practice, of relation, of spirit, and of governance. And being in good relations with a people and with a particular place requires that kind of grounded specificity and patience and a lot of will. So Nyawe, thank you, and I look forward to hearing the next speaker and discussion.
Here, okay. So, I'm afraid what I have to say is doomed to be quite futile compared to what has just been exposed by the two previous speakers, and also by Tim Ingold in the lecture he gave the other day, which I thought was also very profound and probably one of the best I've ever heard in the last years. It's the anniversary of the Department of Architecture, and if I may add, it's a little anniversary for me, because it was exactly 20 years ago that I was invited to Cornell to give a lecture. It so happens at that time I was dreaming to advocate poetic of design that would be rooted in site specificity, using the language of architect, right? Site rather than program, going from site to program. And I was also fascinated by the idea that the landscapes we inhabit today are maybe what we could call hyper-landscape, in the sense that they are not what we basically understand by landscape, a point of view on a given thing, that they are, most of them are superimposing different regimes of landscapes. And at that time, when I received this invitation, I was very curious. Actually, I received two invitations at the same time. One was at UPenn in Philadelphia, and I was very, very interested to go there because of Marcel Duchamp, because Duchamp was for me very inspiring in reflecting on landscapes, especially the large glass, this kind of mandala superimposing two windows, as if, it was suggesting that we should build different windows to look at superimposed landscape, deep landscapes in some ways. That we should, in a way, this is the way we looked at landscape in 17th and 18th century Europe. The garden on the foreground, the third nature. The second mid-ground was agriculture, second nature, and then the first nature, nature as given, wilderness, if you will, in the background. And you have that idea that it was a kind of perspectival, theatrical connection of these things. We need, I think, to look at landscapes now in a kind of more vertical understanding, deeper understanding. Anyway, so as Marcel Duchamp's work is all in Philadelphia, I was very interested to go there. But I was even more interested to come to Ithaca because I had noted that several of the architects, the historians that, or authors that in a way fed into this project had at some point come to Cornell, especially three architects who had illustrated themselves in a genre that I would call the situated manifesto. Meaning these architects who at some point choose a city, a given city, right, a metropolis very often, as both the symptom and the inspiration for a strategy for building cities on a more global level. So in a way, Collage City by Colin Rowe was that, in the sense that Rome was, the matrix of this collage. Ungers, you mentioned, was looking at Berlin with Cornell students with the idea, to a strategy of disurbanism in a way, selecting urban genes in the metropolis of Berlin, transformed into islands in a lagoon of nature. And of course, Rem Koolhaas, Delirious New York, who in a way wrote the masterpiece of that genre, calling Manhattanism a strategy of congestion that he advocated for the world in some ways. It was strange that these three metropolitan manifestos were all conceived or started in this little tree city, Ithaca, and they didn't say much about Ithaca itself. It seems to be hidden in plain view, and they were completely looking at metropolises there. So I thought maybe it would be interesting to go there and to make Ithaca the seat of a relative manifesto that would, in a way, try to advocate the reverse of all this. Anyway, I was also intrigued because artists that I was interested in, like Robert Smithson, during the famous Earth Art Show that happened in 1969 at Cornell and was an important moment in the advent of land art, those artists choosing to intervene directly on the land instead of galleries. Smithson had done an incredible project, his last non-site, relating the deepest layers of the site, the salt mines of Cayuga, here to the museum, by what he called a mirror trail, a kind of umbilical cord, that he would then cut, because after that he would only intervene almost on the sites themselves, here and there. And then there was also Gordon Matta Clark, who was a student of architecture, student in architecture here, and his career as an artist was launched from here. And there was this image of the first piece, that was recorded of his work, this rope bridge over 6 Mile Creek over the reservoir there. And this image alone made me very, very willing to see what was that strange place. There was another guy, Vladimir Nabokov. Vladimir Nabokov had spent 12 years, I knew, in Ithaca, probably the longest period he spent anywhere in his life as a writer, where he wrote masterpieces like Lolita, Pale Fire After, and Pnin, all looking at kinds of universities, four-dimensional portraits of universities. And I was fascinated by that because I thought Nabokov was, in a way, the most palimpsestrous writer that I knew at the time. And I was really curious to see where he had chased those butterflies and written those pieces. So I came to Ithaca and I was stunned, really. I was stunned by the beauty of this landscape. I'm a Parisian, born in Paris, central Paris, and all of a sudden it was paradise. Those through valleys, those hanging valleys right in the campus, I thought, that's amazing. I became infatuated with looking at what the Department of Geology had done here, trying to understand the way those finger lace had been carved by the glacier there. Anyway, Louis Agassiz is the father of the glacial theory, that the glaciers during the Pleistocene had carved the northern hemisphere's land, had given this talk at Cornell where he said, at the foundation, at the inauguration of Cornell University, I was never in a single locality where there is presented so much material in so many branches of natural history as here in this beautiful valley. And I thought, what a magnificent expression of the fact that the site is the university itself. The fact that it's not so much in the buildings, it's the land itself who can teach us a lot of stuff. Anyway, so, I went into the archives because we spent 2 years in the end, managed to get invited here, and this became the project. The way these geologists to explain the magnitude of the glacier they went to visit up north, superimposing the plan of Washington onto the Grand Pacific Glacier, or using these kinds of tricks in the 1910s. A monument in Bunker Hill in front of the glacier, a Chicago building, in front of, this one, which I love. It's the caption says, a high-rise building in New York, dwarfed by the earth scraper, the glacier itself. So you can imagine how it was fun. I mean, in a way, Cayuga Lake was the reverse of Manhattan geographically, island versus lake, this matrix. And then these earth-scrape gorges had many, many stories, as many horizons as the buildings of New York had stories themselves. So I thought it was a fantastic place to reflect on this idea that the site is the matrix and the site is the university, as shown by this image of a class in geology at Cornell in the 1940s. So I thought we could use the waters of the falls, to activate the machinery of the Grand Vert, the mill of this, and try to understand what a landscape is. And since there are 9 Malik molds in Duchamp there, I thought I would superimpose 9 stories of people who came here, including, of course, the one that I named in the beginning. But what I didn't know at all was the rest, right? So we did, for 3 years, a site-specific seminar on Cornell, where a theory class, where the rule of the game was you can speak of anything provided that you can relate it in some ways to the site itself. Nothing else is allowed. Anyway, so this is what we played, that little game, using the boîte en valise of Duchamp, but to collect information and materials on this. And of course, I got interested in those figures, those founders of the university. Cornell, of course, himself a kind of self-taught engineer in some ways, were building the mills for the mill owners down in the gorges, building little infrastructure to divert the water toward the mills, or little dams like that, and who also was into agriculture, into this agrarian and Jeffersonian dream that you just mentioned, made this fortune in the Morse telegraph, being the kind of builder of part of that, and then making that fortune that he devoted to building first a Cornell library and then entering the game with the Memorial Act and founding this university. Like, in a way, the stone row, like a dam built between the two gorges in order to delay, to accumulate knowledge, in a way, this self-taught guy, and delay the devolution of knowledge towards its application in the city and elsewhere. And then it's interesting in the campus to see, I was interested to see how this statue of Cornell, just having climbed the hill and being in the middle of the stone row like that, facing this other guy who launched the College of Architecture there, who was this historian, lover of architecture, who dreamt not of dams at all, who dreamt of a collection, a library of buildings, of eclectic things, Greek revival, Gothic revival, neo-Romanesque stuff, and who finally, in a way, had its way also after Cornell there. So you have the engineer and the architect. Colin Rowe, in a little text, said this, like, what a pair of disparate characters. On the one hand, Ezra Cornell, who would insist on placing telegraph poles with his own hands, and who would go out through the ice and snow to repair the wires, and on the other, Andy White, whom one imagines, except in Paris, Berlin, St. Petersburg, could scarcely abandon his library. But then if you follow that line of the two sculptures, you go to the Aquad, exactly to Bailey Hall, named after a third founder of this university, who was a horticulturist, botanist, who was an advocate of nature study, having kids study the fauna and the flora, the local flora. He thought that you have to garden in every school, and became a fervent advocate of farmers. He almost became the minister, the Minister of Agriculture for not Roosevelt but Taft after, but he refused because he had other things to do. But he became a kind of proto-environmentalist, very inspiring, who coined, by the way, the word ruralism early in the 20th century, because he thought that you cannot just have urbanism. That is treating the problem at the end, right? At the end of the rural exodus. You have to develop a ruralism that would attach people to land, to the land, and that would, that would make the world of agriculture a world of fulfillment in a way, and social. So you have at Cornell, they all left in a way their mark in the built campus. The self-taught engineer, starting from the gorges, building this basic dam, rustic dam between the two gorges. Then the eclectic would-be architect, A.D. White, who envisioned his campus as a collection of lessons of bricks and stones in all kinds of different languages. And he had his way in the informal brick part of the campus here with an excellent architect, by the way, on whom we should write more. The first graduate architect of the college, William Henry Miller, who was instrumental in a way in connecting those two very different visions of the campus. We don't have time for that here. And then the horticulturist, the botanist, the advocate of farming there, who also had his way with the project of the plantation, first named the Hortorium, or the Arboretum, who envisioned the campus between all the land between the two gorges, including active farms, as a kind of laboratory of that ruralism there. So this is how E.B. White, in a text of promotion, I'd send my son to Cornell in 1939, described Cornell. He said, Cornell is a fairly big institution. It has 5,000 or 6,000 students counting the rabbit hunters, and it dominates from its high hills above Cayuga Lake, the town which lies at its feet. This physical and spiritual dominance of art over life, of gown over town, is a good thing for a boy to experience for a while. In a place like Columbia or New York University, it must be obvious to the students just from reading the papers that the town holds the whip hand. In New York, dwellers in apartment buildings are in a position to spit out of the window and have it land on the head of a philosopher. This naturally gives the latter the wrong impression and makes him willing to compromise or even dodge. But in Ithaca, the library tower commands the valley, learning dominates industry, and even the toboggan slide deposits the red-cheeked scholar far above the roof of trades, which is basically a description of suburbanism, literally. Those gardens like Villa Lante, you know, which dominates the roofs of trades. It's an architecture of domination, of course, here. But it's really the suburban position which articulates the garden on top, right? Then the city or second nature and agriculture, and then in the distance, you know, and you have that in a way in Ithaca, where the campus stands for that kind of third nature, where the city is under, and then you have the great reservoir of wilderness or beauty of the lake in some ways. But it also exists within the campus itself, in a way, which superimposes, you could say, the plantation, or third nature, the quadrangles of E.B. White, and then second nature and the gorges, first nature under. Now I'd like to go back just to a little quote by Liberty Hyde Bailey, which describes the soil as a porous interface between fossil and renewable resources. The resources that sustain the race, and I suspect that here he means the human race, are of two kinds, but we can discuss that after. Those that lie beyond the power of man to reproduce or increase, and those that may be augmented by propagation and by care. The former are the mines of minerals, metals, and coal, the water, the air, the sunshine. The latter are the living resources in crop and livestock. Intermediate between the two classes stand the soil, on which all living resources depend. While the soil is part of the mineral and earthy resources of the planet, it nevertheless can be increased in its producing power. Even after all minerals and metals and coal are depleted, the race may sustain itself in comfort and progress, so long as the soil is productive, provided, of course, that water and air and sunshine are still left to us. The greatest of all resources that man can make or mar is the soil. Beyond all the mines of coal and all the precious ores, this is the heritage that must be most carefully saved. And as a matter of fact, a lot of agronomists who were at Cornell in the nebulae of the College of Agriculture and of Bailey were absolutely important in criticizing the emergent methods of industrial agriculture, such as, for instance, F.H. King in his famous book, Farmers of 40 Centuries, where he was looking at permanent agriculture in China, Korea, and Japan, marveling at the way the peasants there built the soil, did compost, recycled human waste systematically into the metabolism of agricultural production. Or Russell Smith, who is one of the best reference of agroforestry today, who in the 1930s, was also advocating a permanent agriculture based on tree crops instead of just cereals. And it's a whole lineage that goes to Albert Howard and organic agriculture in England, which was also very, very influenced by Indian, but of India. The way people in Indore, where he was, at the same time as Geddes, by the way, in Indore, the way, he was sent like a colonial agronomist and learned from India, and in a way, organic agriculture is that lesson in some ways. And in a way, permaculture is exactly those books that I just mentioned about permanent agriculture are direct influence on the thinking of permaculture nowadays here. So the layer behind was, of course, this dispossession, this imposition of those grids, the military tract, the figure of Simeon DeWitt, the chief geographer of the state, who was literally a gridman there, built grids, and he is one of the instrumental designers of the famous 1811 grid of Manhattan, which Rem Koolhaas describes as the most courageous act of prediction in Western civilization. But while he was busy designing that grid, of course, his thoughts were all on Ithaca. This is where, he said, this is where I want to be when he was busy there. And in Ithaca, the author of the military tract had in fact taken the lion's share of the military tract, building a kind of exception, a bigger lot within the military tract, which was his after 3 years, right? Right where Ithaca is, on the inlet, as if it was something that had been already attributed, but in fact was designed for himself. As a chief geographer, he could name the city Ithaca, since it was in the township of Ulysses there, and he pretended that there was a reason, because it looked like the bay in the island of the Greek navigator. I'll let you judge. Then he did this kind of inland island. That was really his project, a kind of island surrounded by basins, fed by the gorges, and linked to Cayuga Lake by a canal that would be, in his dream, connected to the Erie Canal, which he had contributed designing, right, and would make this inland island of Ithaca connected to the world through that things. So Ithaca evolved, etc. And then, of course, the first sentence of the text by E.B. White that I quoted, the first sentence is this one: Cornell is in Ithaca, New York, where Greek meets Indian, right? He was alluding to the fact that only names of the townships and everything and every cities came from Europe, and they were superimposed to or juxtaposed to indigenous names or derived names for the natural features like the lake, the falls, or things like that. So there was a kind of palimpsestuous effect there. Yeah, this is what, in his very laconic style, Rem Koolhaas says about Indians, about the paranoid critical method, inventing inventing false facts to build up a new reality. He says, Paranoid critic activity existed long before its formal invention. When Columbus sailed west, he wanted to prove two distinct hypotheses. First, that the world was round, and two, that he would reach India by sailing westward. The first conjecture was right, the second wrong. Yet, when he printed his footsteps on the New World, he proved both these to his own satisfaction. From that moment, the natives became Indians, fabricated evidence that their discoverer had indeed reached India, fingerprints of a speculative error. A paranoid critic race, they were doomed to extinction when the mistake was discovered, wiped out as embarrassing evidence. Okay, the first image that Rem Koolhaas shows in his book is this one, a map of novel Amsterdam in 1672. And he marvels at that map because he says, well, it doesn't look at all like New York, right, at the time. So it's a proof that right from the beginning, this island was a territory where everything was imagined by a proof, a first step in the delirium, right? In fact, as he probably knew it, this is not a map of New York, it's a hoax. It was a guy, he took a map of Lisbon, right? And named it a map of Amsterdam. You know, you could sell that in Europe. People, they will not come back that soon to tell you that that was a hoax. But the interesting thing is the cartouche here. And we are, you know, on top of this here. We are here in a region that he calls Lac des Iroquois, peuple très cruel. Lakes of the Iroquois are very cruel people. Very strange thing. And of course, we are in these territories on the 16th. I'm not going to go after what has been so beautifully said here, but I marveled when, with the poor sources that I had 20 years ago, marvel at that cosmology. The sky woman thing, which in a way was an illustration for me. It's much deeper than that. But what I tried to name hyper-landscape, right? A kind of vertical, deep understanding of the landscape where the earth is between this primal sea and this sky village where, well, you see what I mean. Anyway. And then also by the complementary story or narrative, the political one that was at the basis of this forest diplomacy. Anyway, I wouldn't dare go into this in front of you here. But of course, that was very impressive. Also, everything I could gather with my poor sources and my paresse or fatigue about the ecology of all that. And I show these images here down because of Tim Ingold's image the other day here. But of course, the Three Sisters, the gourds, the beans, the corn, and the whole metabolism between, that's exactly what we were talking about before. So all this eradicated by the Sullivan army, by town destroyer, and certainly there is the story of dispossession and potential repossession of lands to the different nation here. But there is also the treasure trove of lessons of ecological lessons there that, of course, should be not stolen from those nations, but of course should be are food for thought and food for practice for everybody. And they probably, yes, I showed this book that probably many of you have read, The Down of Everything by David Graeber, where David Graeber insists again on the fact that the conversation, if we can name it like that, between chiefs like Kondiaong and the European colonizer didn't only lead, for instance, to an emulation of the federal. I mean, not only the fact that, you know, this hypothesis that the Constitution of America would be a kind of the federation would be a kind of imitation, emulation of the federation of the Six Nations for them, but more than that, the whole Enlightenment, what we call the Enlightenment in Europe, came as a kind of response to the questions and the critics posed by the Iroquois or Wendat to their colonizers there. So I think that for all that are, at least for all that are not natives, as I am, there is still immense things to learn, as you just showed, Amber, particularly in your illustration and explanation of the depth of the narrative of Sky Woman. But I do think that in the tradition, in the agrarian tradition, there are also good things to combine or to keep with this. For instance, Wendell Berry. Wendell Berry's Unsettling of America very well explained how the settlers were doomed themselves by the way they had treated the nations there, and that they were unsettled, the one after the others, by huge, big corporations and capitalism, basically. So we should read these guys. We should read another Ithacan, Kirkpatrick Sale, in his plea for a bioregional vision, a kind of reconnection of what the land and the other than humans and humans can coexist in a way in some kind of geographical watersheds or things like that. Revisit with him hypotheses like Patrick Geddes' valley section, the idea that the city is just a moment in a bigger organism, that the real subject of urbanism is not just the city, but is really the region itself. Or listen to people like that, you know, Wes Jackson of the Land Institute, particularly in this book that I like very much, Becoming Native to This Place. I know we will discuss that with Meredith, where he says that in 1994. To a large extent, this book is a challenge to the universities to stop and think what they are doing with the young men and women they are supposed to be preparing for the future. The universities now offer only one serious major: upward mobility. Little attention is paid to educating the young to return home or go some other place and dig in. There is no such thing as a homecoming major. But what if the universities were to ask seriously what it would mean to have as our national goal becoming native to this place, this continent? We are unlikely to achieve anything close to sustainability in any area unless we work for the broader goal of becoming native in the modern world. And that means becoming native to our places in a coherent community that is in turn embedded in the ecological realities of its surrounding landscape. And there are many other, of course, references that we should mobilize to better learn from the places where we are. If I may end on we tried in a way to, in an exhibition recently in Lisbon, in the Architecture Triennale, to reflect on these material from the Paleolithic to today. That was very ambitious like that. On the relays, it was called Architecture and Agriculture, Taking the Country's Side, if we may do little play on words, even if when it's not our language. And we did this huge mural asking this question behind. I think we are all in a kind of schizophrenia today, and we should be in a kind of cognitive dissonance today. Because when looking, back at the past, at least say the 2 or 3 last centuries, then it all seems as if the urbanization of the world, which has been steadily growing for centuries, is inevitable and integral to history. But then, when probing the future and looking at the environmental issues that are looming there, this same global urbanization looks rather improbable, impossible, and like the end of history. And so how are we to deal with a situation that looks both inevitable and impossible? I think these are the kinds of things that we have to deal with in our institution. We tried to summarize the situation like this, right? Right in the middle, the urbanization of the world. And this all around environmental drama, like the erosion of soils, right? The depletion of water, of course, biodiversity collapse and climate change, meaning the degradation of the conditions of life on our planet, and also other kinds of issues such as the depletion not only of fossil energy, but also of metals, of rare earth, of lots of things that are crucial to the transition economy or to, the digital also economy that everybody thinks is going to save us from everything. I'd like to finish on this. This is how David Holmgren, one of the founders of permaculture, summarized the problems a few years ago. He said we have 2 problems at the same time. Let's say 2 kinds of problems at the same time. One is the vertical arrow. He names it global warming, but you could add biodiversity collapse. It means this is the arrow of the degradation of the conditions of life on this planet. And it can be, or it might be, we don't know, slow or very fast, right? So slow at the bottom, fast. But then we have another problem, which he calls oil decline. But you could add also metal decline, material resources decline, all kind. This is, let's say, the diminution of the power to act and the power to transform, right? Of dense energy, dense stuff, all the stuff with which the industrial society works. We don't know, will it be slow? Will it be fast? If you cross those 2 things, you have 4 quadrants, and then you have 4 different scenarios. Here, here you have both slow oil decline, you still have power, right? But you have a destructive global warming. And this scenario he calls brown tech, because here you can feel that people are going to gather the energy that is still there, the material that are still there, to act against climate change, build huge dams against sea level rise, etc. So it's like China 3.0. Like it's very authoritative states, fascism, you could say. You have the best scenario just under it, green tech, right? Where you have both still energy, still materials, and like benign global warming. So that's the ideal thing, the green tech. You use the energy and the material that you have, for an economy of transition. You build solar panels, you build wind turbines, etc., and you prepare for the moment when things would go down. This is the green tech narrative, right? Then you have this one, the opposite, right, of the scenario that created the Industrial Revolution. You have this one, where you have benign global warming, fast oil decline, energy descent. And that you can expect, that's the ideal scenario for permaculture. That means urban exodus, right? People go where the energy is still in the form of living stuff, right? And then you have the last one, which is the worst on paper, and this he calls lifeboats. This is survivalism today, catastrophism, etc. We just try to illustrate what it could mean in terms of the to make a compass, right, of the future relationship between agriculture and architecture, cities and countryside. And we proposed a little compass with 4 scenarios. First narrative is incorporation. The city becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. It's a logic of concentration. You make buildings that grow foods, right? You do something like that, you know, where you have, of course, Elon Musk's machine. You have nuclear plants everywhere. The city is the future, the manifest destiny of humankind, and it's a tower of control of all the rest, right? So, second scenario is negotiation. So it's a kind of different one, right? Where the cities still grow, but incorporate agriculture, forestry as part of their program, right? It's a narrative that has a lot of success with architects. The horizontal metropolis. It's in a way a new Broadacre city. You could say it's agricultural urbanism. Then you have the reverse movement, infiltration, what we usually call urban agriculture. These are agricultural initiatives that go into existing cities on the roofs, on the side of the roads, everywhere, that penetrates, infiltrates the city. Of course, this is rarely massive. This is like a penetration, just like that, right? But it can be massive. Think of La Havana in the special period, or think of Detroit after the collapse of the automobile industry. And finally, you have a last one. Maybe the word is too much, but what we could call secession. And a lot of people are secessionists today, meaning that whether or not they are in the orbit of a metropolis, they think that the real what is at stake today is to build communities or societies that are much more self-sustainable and rooted in an environment that they well understand. I think these, of course, are all happening at the same time, in fact. They are not exclusive from one another as a scenario, but they are based on very, very different interpretation of the reasons of the mess we are into nowadays. And I think in our schools of design, agriculture, architecture, we should think about those things and what kind of future we want to go in. I'll finish with this question: what is a world? And my provisional answer to that question, a world, I think, is a territory, a region, a country, where one could imagine to project and spend the entirety of one's existence. Thank you for your attention.
So thank you, everyone. The idea was that we take about 20 minutes to half an hour and hear any responses and questions and have a discussion with our speakers. If there are questions from the audience, they would be welcome, but I will invite Sean Anderson and Jolene Rickard to come and speak, and if our speakers would like to come and join us at the front, you're welcome to. And then I should say there is delicious food outside after that. Would you like to join us up here? Yeah.
I have to begin this evening with just profound thanks and gratitude to Sachem George for sharing your words that come before all else, but also to our speakers for sharing your language and words before all else. It is a profound joy to hear the original language of this land that we are so fortunate to be on. And so many of us are trying to reconcile how to live with, live on, and be a part of this land. And I think the impetus for these conversations, for these presentations, for the students and the faculty who also have been quite fortunate to hear all of you this evening, and our earlier speaker with Tim Ingold, is concerned with the loss that we find ourselves in. Profound loss at multiple scales of biodiversity, of humanity, loss of ethics, loss of morals, loss at scales that are, to use your words, Professor Moreau, both inevitable and impossible. How do we reconcile loss of language and loss of ways in which to understand the dispossession, disenfranchisement, and indeed what it means to be home when you can't return to it? So I was quite moved first to say that I learned so much from all of you, and I learned to be with you this evening. And it's a great challenge in a way to be a moderator when your words and your worlds and your lands should be forefront at all things. And so I wanted to first reference Amber Adams and to think about the kind of earth that I am set down upon and what that means. And with Meredith, I want to reference, these are all my notes that I was furiously writing, but trying to listen at the same time, to think about measures of land. So we have a physical, always changing realm in which we are part of, and then we have the imposition of codes and language and lines that are all man-made through juridical processes in order to own and contain land. And for Professor Moreau to think of containment in particular, especially with reference to the GROUNDWORK, and the containment that Duchamp actually spoke of, which was the hinge as a space and a site of loss in between the bride and her bachelors, in between production and industry, in between the surface of the industry of production and meaning. So tonight I wanted to begin this brief moment of sharing. If you could each reflect on loss, and if it is possible, to provide or provoke ways of redress, whether it's through your own work, through your own kind of creative production, or even through your teaching and your thinking in a university setting.
Who's first? I'll jump in. These both work. One of the reasons that I keep going back to the Haudenosaunee story of creation and why I think it is such a brilliant, brilliant narrative is because it addresses exactly the kind of losses that you're raising, and they're multidimensional, and they're all happening at once, and they're overwhelming, and they're terrifying. And the figures in that story don't gloss over any of it. Within that story, there's almost every permutation of human reaction that you can imagine. And what doesn't actually turn up in this story, as Sébastien mentioned, of creation, does get addressed in the story of Garna Sologoa, the Great Law of Peace. They're sort of in discussion, as many other narratives in the Haudenosaunee tradition are. So we look at this story and we see all of these different ways and the outcomes specific to having those reactions in this biome. So we've kind of got somebody making all of our mistakes for us in terms of addressing the idea of this stunning, devastating loss. And what happens in the story is a long process of redress between the people who are in this place that ultimately becomes Earth. And one more thing about this piece is that the relationships between the people in it and the relationships between the place, the biome, the Earth, are not separable. As they negotiate Scano between one another, they are also negotiating Scano with this place and everything in it. So the redress, the reconciliation, which is a word that sticks in my throat, but there it is, the eventual emergence of Scano, however impermanent it is, because as I said earlier, Scano always moves, it can't stand still, is something that is laid out beautifully, beautifully for us within that narrative. And that's what I've been coming back to over and over again.
I don't know how to answer your question. I don't know, because I'm not sure I would be speaking of the same loss. Loss can be understood in many, many ways. What I was very impressed, but shouldn't be I who say that. When I read those studies on the League, on the Iroquois, was these rituals of diplomacy. I'm using the words that I find of diplomacy to assuage, the pain, the loss of the other. All these gestures of clearing the tears so that you can still see me, wiping the path between the throat. I have a throat problem, by the way, just now. All these things, and seeing how important they were and how related they were to all kinds of making of, I don't know, it shouldn't be me who talks about that. But I was really, really impressed, and also very impressed to see how the colonists actually had to go into these rituals with the Iroquois, and for some of them seemed to know them quite well, Johnson or like that. I think it gives quite, I remember reading Fenton explaining that there is this myth that the Confederation found a kind of model in the Iroquois League, at least the kind, how come they would be able, these savage, as Franklin says, to be politically organized, and us, we wouldn't be, and they all had been in these Indian affairs, as they said, no? Or forest diplomacy stuff. And he said, so there is this theory, but it's politically correct and everything. But you can feel that it's not a stupid hypothesis, I think. Not that it would be a good template, but there was certainly a strong influence on the colonists of these things. Of course, dismissed and
So I finished my PhD 2 years ago in the Department of Geography at UC Berkeley. And it's a very theory-heavy degree, and one of the things we were always having to study was theories of change. How does change happen? Marxian theories of change, other philosophical theories of change, even geological theories of change. This was the root of geography. It was physical and human geographers together. And yet all throughout that training, which is, it was one of the better geography departments, there was nothing about how to deal with loss. And so I feel like there have been these entire disciplines that try to create a kind of objectivity towards how does change happen and how does capital develop the urban versus the rural. All of these questions that I'm actually finding out tonight are very similar between architecture and geography. And but none of that gave the kind of lessons of how to deal with loss that I've found in my own home community and in those instructions. And so I think when we're talking about how to deal with loss, there's a lot of Indigenous scholars who have written about how so many Indigenous people have lived through various apocalypses and have lived through those just incredible and unfathomable upheavals in the way life was lived and had to confront them, and just the incredible feat that we still have someone like Sachem Sam George here, and that we still have our elders, and we still have our clan mothers, and we still have our governance systems is absolutely amazing. And I think one of the greatest things we can do is learn from that and I guess I don't know how to say this any better, but not in an extractive and abstract way, that these are governance systems in territories, in place, and I think we need to find generative ways to have conversations about how to live with each other on this land. And I think one of the greatest challenges of things like climate change and catastrophic change aren't going to be, how many degrees does the temperature rise? It's how do we live together? And how do we learn to be with each other? And I think that's just going to be the greatest challenge, because the loss isn't going to be just of like my favorite cookie in a supply chain issue. It's going to be so much greater than that. And I think we have great instructions and can learn from them. And I wish I could be more articulate, but that's what I've got right now. Thank you.
I'm not going to respond to the notion of loss, but I'll make an observation. And so my question is, I'm wondering if we all heard the same thing today. I think we all probably heard many different things. And I'm thinking about how it is that we're even here, how Sachem George is here, how Dr. Adams, Dr. Palmer are here, why I'm here. I would argue that Sachem George is here because of a relationship that was built between faculty and respectfully to his community and him. So it was possible for this conference to pick up the phone or put out an email to ask him to be with us. But in order to make that happen, it took 10 years of building trust to open that space. Because when I came to Cornell, which is approximately 10 years ago, it wasn't there. And so I can't speak for him, but what I would say is that he has trust with individuals here, but I would argue he's educated me that he doesn't trust the institution. And so I think about what we think we heard here in relationship to what Amber is sharing with us. And I'm deeply concerned that it's a menu for some people of possibilities for extraction, rather than thinking about it as this deep philosophical, observational experience that's related specifically to this part of the world, that needs to be considered in the same way that other great philosophies are considered. But how do we equip ourselves to do that when there isn't really an architecture of support, and I don't mean architecture in the build sense, but in the structural sense of finding our way to these ideas in a respectful way. I was very troubled, and not to be disrespectful of the opening lecture for this series, the use of the terminology of relationship and kinship, the recognition of the work of Fred Meyer. I didn't hear one Indigenous scholar recognized in Tim Ingold's lecture, yet the entire lecture was laced with secondary sources of Indigenous knowledge. I've long seen Haraway's work as an interesting gloss of Indigenous thought, but unhooked, unhinged from a deep relationship to place. And so I feel that between the work of our three very powerful speakers this evening, that it represents, for me, different aspects of what we're all grappling with. On the one hand, we do have deep philosophies that are related to place. On the other hand, we have the ongoing rupture and trauma of colonization that cannot be erased from the land. And so then how do we put that in dialogue with the thinking that of design, the thinking of structure, of how we move into the future? And I'm concerned at this juncture, you know, every 25 years, American Indian, Native American, Indigenous thought becomes fashionable. And are we in that cycle now? Or is there actually a profound shift to really reconsider that every place in the world has an Indigenous philosophy and perspective, but that how is that articulated when, I think Meredith pointed out, the terrain is so uneven? So how do we level that terrain so that we can actually begin to think about the so that we can begin to think generatively about this very complicated question of our existence as human beings in this world. I think we had all of the material laid out.
Yeah.
But can we hear it? Can we think it? And so I don't have a question right now. My question is really, how can we not do this extractively? My question is, how can we create respectful relationships? And is there actually space at a university that has yet to reconcile its relationship to Indigenous peoples? Which I think that needs to be answered. And I don't think any one of us in this room can answer it. It has to be, the leadership of this university has to recognize the dilemma that this university in particular has as it relates to this profound experience and knowledge. And so that's, I can't. I don't have a question.
Right on, Jolene.
I can't.
Right on. I don't know how much time we have up here. It is just an extraordinary, humbling experience to be among you this evening, because it makes me indeed question our own complicity when we are here, and at the same time trying to transmit, understand, and in fact, to use the word reconcile, maybe to reckon that we are living in a colonial space. We are living in the afterlives of multiple colonialisms, and that when we start to disentangle our own individual selves from the relationships of the colonial panoply, of the systems that have been in place well in advance of the Enlightenment, well in advance of the moment in which land became property, land became owned, that the spaces upon which we are all sited today and that we are trying to transgress in often in a school of architecture. I hate these masks. The space of architecture allows for that transgression to happen with the potential for criticality. And I would argue that the recognition of blackness, of the recognition of indigeneity, the recognition of so-called ontologies that have for so long been forgotten, if not erased in most cases, we are, at least in the United States, in the Americas, beginning to see the possibility that we could maybe see some light at the end of the tunnel, or for lack of a better metaphor, to turn a corner and to understand that in a space of knowledge production, like a school of architecture, we can begin to understand geographies of knowledge, economies of nature, and visualities of production and criticality and schizophrenia, but I'm not going to get into Kulhas tonight. So I on certain days might be more optimistic, Jolene, certain days. But I absolutely recognize the notion that we cannot work from a point of the colonial model paradigm of extractivism. So we have to learn from the knowledge holders, the keepers of the language. But we have to do it in a way that maybe isn't about people in an audience staring at us, but for allowing a kind of reciprocity, a conversation on the ground, maybe, around a table, because the table becomes the kind of paradigmatic architectural space, four sides, or a round table, even better, to be on the turtle's back, perhaps. And there's food out there, of course, but yes, so I don't mean to keep talking because I would love to hear your thoughts, but I'm just reflecting on everything that you've shared with us this evening, which is so extraordinary, and to think about how all of these configurations of race, of indigeneity, of loss, is also confronting, I think, for students of architecture and architects alike, who is the public? Because your publics, your peoples, your nations have long been disappearing, very much on purpose, very much controlled by as we heard this evening.
I have to make an intervention here.
So please,
Because that's
please.
what in Indigenous studies we would call the deficit model.
Okay,
Because our communities are resilient.
absolutely.
And so we're not disappearing.
Okay.
It's only the projection, the ongoing projection of the notion that we're disappearing.
Got it.
And so I think we have to shift
Yeah.
our thinking.
No. Absolutely. No, and this is my misrecognition, right? Is that
It's how we have to learn to talk to each other.
exactly?
And so we're
Exactly.
it's a teachable moment.
Yes, please. I wasn't trying to say that you are disappearing. I would say that in a school of architecture, for instance, I have a PhD in art history and took many courses in architecture history. Not once in this department was the Native American experience ever mentioned, ever.
Yeah. Right, so then how could you,
So
you know,
where do we begin? And I would say that there are a number of faculty members here where we have to return, we have to begin again. And I think in everyone's presentation was about that, to begin again is to also recognize one's not knowing.
the irony is Indigenous studies or Native studies classes have been taught here
Yeah,
for over 40 years.
exactly.
But the question is, the message sent is it a priority to take these classes as critical knowledge?
Right,
And so the classes are there,
right.
but it's just a question of the motivation to engage with the material.
Yeah.
And so, I think that's,
Yeah. No, I mean, we're having a conversation here. My apologies. No, I had invited Tristan Atton and Robert Lee to begin last year's Preston Thomas series. And I think it was the first time that many of us, including myself, had recognized and seen the level of depredation and extractivism that forges what then becomes institutions of democracy, the Landgrab University. So when we understand that these institutions of democracy are actually based on the obliteration of culture and the division of people, we have to understand then that the very act of making architecture can be one of repair. And so I would hasten to say and argue that we are in a moment, if you will, where I think many of us in the discipline, many of us in the academy are trying to make our own amends and trying to imagine the possibility to repair.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we have to look at the department chair, Caroline O'Donnell, as having, making it a necessity to include this in this discussion. And I think that comes out of a broader understanding of the impacts of coloniality. And so we do share, I think, we do share things that across, I think, our specific cultural locations. And so I do think everyone here is trying to like find a way to bring these together, and also you. And that's what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
But, you know, I'm still a little skeptical about what we're, based on how we're taught to think,
Yeah.
if we can actually hear what's been put down.
Right.
And that's something, I guess, to learn.
Yeah.
So.
No,
so-
absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, so,
Please.
Your talk was as it connected right? This is a very practical, political issue. In this, I mean, I just started teaching here not long ago, and there is a lot of interest from the students to know about this history. And there is a lot of ignorance about this history. Right? My question is, and then I think, you know, Jolene, you're talking about the administration or the central, whatever it is, right? But we are all here, and the students are asking, and they want, you know, they're like, yeah, did you know that they just put the recognition like 6 months ago? I mean, they're like, you know. So what are the practical venues? What are the things that have been done? What are the conversations that have been started? Or the fights that have been fought with the so-called central administration or amongst us to repair? Repatriation is not a new word. It has become a reality in a lot of places. What is the repatriation plan? Right? What practically, you call it repair, whatever it is, but there has to be that discussion. Right? And it has happened already in our country, in this country, in other communities. So I think it's an action that has to start if it hasn't been started. And from what I heard you saying, you have a report, you have a website, I mean, you have started, right? That conversation.
I mean, it's the work that I have been, joined as a follower of the incredible work that Dr. Jolene Rickard, Dr. Kurt Jordan, and that students have also led. So I don't think I'm the best person to comment on sort of the long history of the battle to get Indigenous studies recognized here at Cornell University. You know, you've been at the center of that, Dr. Kurt Jordan and many others have. To get that institutional support. And also, and I think another hurdle, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jolene, would be to get the support of surrounding communities to sort of trust that department. And it's, you know, to get the relationships built between, you know, you can't just get a bunch of funding and start a department without that connection, without that dedication, without the needs of the communities being met. And to try to create a real space where Indigenous knowledge can be fed, can flourish, and then return to community seems absolutely important. And that's a very long process that you'd probably much be better suited to comment on if you want to.
we don't have time for that today.
How many days do you have?
But it's a great observation. Yes, there's a, yeah.
Yeah.
Is that it? Okay.
So I just say that I think these individuals, I would just, to conclude if I can, if I may, I wouldn't want to be the last word when our words began with you, Satyam George. But if I may, I would just say that our horizon is marked. And we can go toward that horizon of potential and possibility and community and reconciliation on even the minorest scales, or we can turn away from that horizon. And if we turn away now, if we turn away from the suffering and the devastations that continually happen because of all of the things that we have heard this evening, we are, in essence, destroying ourselves. And we are here to make good, and hopefully, with everything that you've spoken about this evening, this good can move forward and move this department forward. So, thank you so much.
How to not make friends, right?
Or how to make friends.
Well, thank you very much for your thoughts. It was, I think, a very generous framing of the experience.
Your attention, please.
Well, he's got to talk.
The thing that what Jolene said about being colonized. But we're not the only ones. You have been too. So I'm going to ask every single one of you to think about decolonizing yourself so that when you do walk around that corner, you'll already know what's there. If you need some good, I was thinking along the way here that architecture, there isn't anything you can come up with that hasn't already been here.